Marshall amps were in the 70s when I grew up. They were the rock and roll amplifier.
And it was in junior high, I think in the ninth grade, that somebody said, hey, you got to listen to this Robin Trower record. He's playing at the Long Beach Arena. We should go. It was this fuzzed, soaked sound with 4 or 6 Fawn Marshall cabinets behind him and Marshall heads. And he's playing this white early 70s Strat. And I looked at it and I went, that's it. That's what I'm going to do. That's the look.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. Before we get started, if you want to hear these episodes commercial-free, you can grab the Backstage Pass on Patreon for just $5 a month. Link in the show notes, or you can go to bookedonrock.com. Now, on to our guests. This episode, Peter Margolis and Brian Ranks. They are the authors of Collecting Loud History, a comprehensive 600-page hardcover book that chronicles the history of Marshall amplifiers from 1964 to 1980. The book serves as both a photographic history and a technical reference for one of the world's most extensive collections of vintage Marshall equipment. Guys, welcome to the podcast. It is great to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
This is a project that evolved over 6 years, from what I understand. You've worked together since 1994. What was the moment that you realized that the Marshall story hadn't fully been documented and you needed a book like this?
Well, I think both of us can answer. I'll start, and then Brian will probably agree with me. We met one another in 1994 after the big earthquake that we had in Los Angeles. And I had a house in Studio City at the time that was, the back house was filled with Marshall amplifiers and cabinets, and records and magazines and baseball cards, and a studio and all that stuff. And the earthquake really rocked our house literally off the foundation, and the contents of this room basically caved in. The doors couldn't be open, the window couldn't be open, and it was floor to ceiling, parts and guitar necks and speakers and tubes and stuff everywhere. And in the process of going through everything and finally getting the door open and trying to straighten everything out, I noticed that the Marshalls had been damaged. Grills had been ripped, and things had been dented, and vinyl covering torn and things like that. I wanted to get everything fixed up eventually, and I didn't know anybody that took care of this sort of stuff. So I went to a guy named Bob Bradshaw, who was out in North Hollywood at the time, and he was, building pedal boards and things for studio guys, and he was the guy who would fix my stuff. And so I said to him, "Hey, we just had this big earthquake, and I need to get this stuff fixed." And he said, "I got your guy." And he said, a couple doors down, there's a guy who does nothing but cosmetic repairs on old vintage Marshall amps. And it was like, imagine my luck. And so I met Brian, and we struck up a fast friendship. I had a lot of the stuff that he not only repaired, but coveted and collected himself. And so we found mutual ground pretty quickly, and we started working together. First, Brian went through my collection and told me what things were, because I really had no idea. I mean, I knew I had a lot of Marshalls, but I didn't know what they were specifically. So Brian started to educate me about what I had, and we went through each piece systematically. And there were things that were wrong with them. Speakers weren't correct, or, parts were missing, logos were broken, grills were torn, things like that. And he went through them one by one and got them looking like they looked when they left the Marshall factory. And as we were going through them and fixing them up, and I was starting to learn, Brian, both of us have other careers. Brian was going on the road with various, rock stars and pop stars, and as a guitar tech. And so he would be out on the road somewhere, and he'd, have a day off and end up in a music store and call me and go, "Hey, they have this and this. I mean, I'm going to pick this up. I think you should grab this." And we did that times 100. And then, Brian would, there'd be a guitar player, in the band, and he'd say, "Hey, Brian, I want to get rid of this Marshall. Do you know anybody that wants it?" And he would call me up and say, "I already have this one. I think you should pick this up. It's a good price." And then so I started developing, as did Brian, a pretty extensive collection, even beyond what I already had, which was, by most standards, a lot. I think I had, at the time I met Brian, I had 20 cabinets and 20 heads. That collection is now, 7 or 8 times larger than it was when we met. And then along the way, I met some other guys who were collectors and started selling me stuff when they didn't want things anymore. And so what started out for Brian and I as a business relationship ended up as a very close friendship. And we realized after doing this for 30 years and acquiring these Marshalls and restoring the Marshalls and repairing the Marshalls, and sometimes we would buy stuff and go, yeah, this isn't really great. Let's off this one and get, we're missing this year, this color, this model, this whatever. We realized somewhere around 2017, 2018 that we needed to document what we were doing and what we had acquired. And there is really nothing like our book. There are other books about Marshall amplifiers and speaker cabinets, Marshall products that are great for what they are. Michael Doyle's books, The History of Marshall. There's a number of books, and they're wonderful. And Brian and I own them, and they're great reference manuals. But they were lacking certain things. And we just felt like this information was nowhere in the world. And what really cemented it for both of us is, and we would send each other like links to, Craigslist ads or Reverb ads or eBay auctions. And Brian would send me the link and I'd look at it and he'd go, "What's wrong with this?" And I go, "Well, the guy says it's a 71 and it's not a 71. How can you tell?" "Well, look at the rivets on the handles. That's how you can tell." And so we started to see all these auctions and advertisements that were incorrect. And the big one was, selling a plexi, selling a 1973 Marshall plexi. Well, no, you're not, because the last plexi was made in the middle of 1969. So we would see all these auctions that people were selling their stuff and marking it incorrectly. And based on what you have and what year it is and what color it is and what model it is and whether it's a plexi or not, radically alters the price and the value, and whether the transformers are real, and so all of this changes the value, the price, how much you should sell something for. And nothing was out there to tell anybody not only what they had, but what it was worth, how to list it, how to identify it. So you don't walk in a Guitar Center off the street and go, "Hey, I'll take that Marshall cabinet," and the thing says, 1969 Marshall cabinet, and you're none the wiser, and you buy something that they say is a 69 and it's not.
So you're keeping them honest and making sure that the people are getting
It's the good and the bad is that it tells people exactly what they have, and if they're going to buy something, exactly what they're going to buy. The bad news is for us is we can no longer go and buy something and go, "Hey, this is a great deal." The guy doesn't know what he has, because now it's out there. It's out there for everybody to find. This is what I have, and this is what it's really worth. And so that was part of the reason for it, but it was really we got frustrated in that none of the information that we had acquired over the years by having our hands in hundreds and hundreds of these things, the information just wasn't there. There were bits and pieces if you hunted for it. There's a website that talks about old Celestian speakers and their frame numbers and cone numbers and things like that. But that site is dedicated to just that. It doesn't talk about, what's inside a Marshall amplifier. It doesn't talk about how they are constructed and what screws were used and rivets were used and staples were used and what, our book talks about all that, how to identify what you have. And we systematically go through year by year by year from the first piece that we both have, which is 1964, up to 1980. Brian and I both have pieces after 80, but we kind of felt like that was a good place to stop.
Because that's a question I'm sure you get asked a lot.
It was 600 pages at that point. And it was like, we can't really make anything much bigger than that. And So after 80, a section of the book is devoted to, we call it the parts section, the parts reference. And this was really Brian's baby, because, he is the keeper of all the Marshall parts and knows how to identify every single thing they ever made. And so it was his idea to like, let's put a page of every single wheel and every single handle and every logo and every grill type and every what screw was used on the back cover and what screws or rivets were used on the handles, and talk about the T-nuts and talk about all these things. So there's page after page after page of description of parts. That really separates our book from anything else because that's never been talked about.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask that too. And Brian, if you want, you can also add to this too. But it's not like this book was just slapped thrown together. It was very important to you guys. I'm assuming to have this packaged in the way that it is. It's a beautifully packaged book.
I started doing this stuff in the early 80s and was fortunate enough to get hooked up with the Marshall artist relations people and took care of a lot of well-known guitar players' stuff and restored things for them. So I managed to get into the fold. But what I realized while I was doing a lot of this stuff for people is I would disassemble things because there were no reference manuals or anything that even Marshall could pass on to me to tell me the difference between one year's things and another year's things or whatever. I had to write copious notes for years. And after years and years of writing all kinds of notes for myself about all the details, paragraphs full of details about all these cabinets and heads that would come through the shop, I eventually began to realize, probably by the late 80s, I started to see patterns. And I could then start to identify where things in the production line at a company, just like cars, would change for the following year. Sometimes only just slightly, but eventually the pieces of the puzzle would come together, and with enough notes, you could figure out, oh, okay, here's the line as the sequence went as they changed things in production. And therefore, once you realize that sequence, you can identify what years or even what half years certain things were made, because Marshall never kept notes on anything other than the amplifier heads, and those are dated by a chassis number, which is easily discernible, and it's in lots and lots of books. But all the cabinets and their serial numbers and what was in certain cabinets versus other cabinets, that information was never divulged really by Marshall. And so it was anybody's guess. Whatever the best story was on a piece of gear and what you were logically able to believe were it. And so I wanted to do like a reference manual for years, kind of showing the information that I had come across and figured out and wrote down and so forth. And then I met Peter and we started working on his collection, and one thing came together after another, and eventually we decided, let's do a little bit more than just a reference manual. Let's put together some stories and some history, and try to get as much information out there, because as us older folks go, there's no new young fellas coming along that are learning this stuff, and they'll never live long enough to figure it out, because the price of this stuff has gotten to be such that you basically need a stock market investment to go buy things to start to learn about them.
Yeah, sure. And the website collectingloudhistory.com is a good place for people to go to just to get an example and see what this book looks like. You've got pictures from the book on the website as well.
Well, I actually have one in front of me conveniently. Okay. So it looks like this. Well, let me get rid of the glare like that. And as you can see, it's very large. It's, about 1.5 inches thick. And a couple things that, to follow through with what Brian said. So somewhere in the late, 2017, 18, and we realized that, Brian initially said, let's put a catalog together. And I had been involved in several books prior to this one. And I knew what, by virtue of, putting these out and making mistakes, I knew what worked and what didn't work. And I knew what would sell and what wouldn't sell. And the last couple books that I did, I found a book designer, and his name is Denny Anderson, and Denny is very responsible for the way that this book looks, which is really significantly different than any book that we've ever seen on amplifiers or guitars. I mean, the photographs in this thing, and the layout is staggeringly beautiful. I mean,
The word stunning on the website is
Brian will tell
appropriate.
you, really something far more than we had ever bargained for. And Denny is really responsible for the way this book looks. Brian and I gave him, we would say, okay, let's start with, 1964. We would give him the images from 1964. We would give him, descriptions, and we would say, like, I'm going to write two paragraphs about this head. It's probably going to take up about 3 inches. Here's sort of the mock-up. And we would write a story. There's a story for each year at the front of each year, which basically says, here's what was going on in the world in 1964. Here's what was going on in music in 1964. Here's what was happening at the Marshall factory and how Marshall was being affected by what was happening in the world and what was happening in music. And now let's take a look at the products from 1964. And that's sort of how we put the book together. I mean, the beginning of the book, there's a bit of history about me, a bit of history about Brian, how we got together, the story of the earthquake, and how we formed our friendship and our working relationship. And then we go into, you know, the years and systematically go through them. But it took us, as we started in late 2019. We had, bandied about the conversation for a couple of years, and we kept saying to, each other, we really need to get this started. We're not getting any younger. And the pandemic of 2020 really sort of helped us because I was out of work for 6 months. And on top of which, I lost a family member. And so I was down for a very long time. And writing the book and working on it really became, I had a lot of time to deal with it, and it sort of helped me get through, this period of time. And then once we got off the ground, and I think, Brian, and I think we actually started with a later chapter. I want to say we started with 1980 or 1979. It was something that we had a lot of. And we gave all the material to Denny, and Denny gave us a mock-up of this chapter. He sent us a PDF of what he felt like it should look like. And when we saw the PDF, we really knew at that point that we had something. Now, I should say prior to that, from 2020 and 2021, we didn't do anything other than photographs. And it took us the better part of 2 years to get all of this stuff photographed. We started out with one photographer and did a bunch of shoots. And I said, Brian, this isn't working. It just doesn't look right. And then we found a guy who lives in Prague, and he shoots for a couple local stores here. And then we had some discussions with him, and he came out and he did 2 sessions here, and he shot about half. And it just didn't work. He was too far away. His schedule didn't work with our schedule. And we needed to get the rest of the stuff shot. But we had enough with what he did to start cobbling the chapters together. So we would do chapters and sort of in random, in no particular order. We jumped around, And, let's say we had all the 1971 shot out with this photographer so we could work on 1971. Or if we were missing something, we would put a placeholder there. And then we found another photographer who happened to be somebody that Brian and I, he used to own a store called Guitars Are Us, and Brian and I in the 80s would purchase from him. His name was Albert Molinaro. Brian somehow reconnected with him in the middle of this project. We had a phone call, the three of us one night for went on for hours and hours. And he said, "Look, guys, I have a photo studio in my house, and I'd love to help you guys get the book done, but everything has to come to me." And it was like, okay, well, we still had 50 Marshall cabinets to shoot of the 100 plus that we shot and 50 heads, which meant one by one they had to go in my car to his house, get them photographed,
Oh,
pick them up, back to the house, get the next one in the car. And we did that for another 2 years to
wow.
get the rest of it shot. And this is his photo studio was up a flight of stairs. So,
Oh, man.
and in my house where all of the Marshalls resided at the time that we shot the book, they were all upstairs. So we spent days and days and days, and Brian and I lost, a good deal of weight. And we did it in the summer of just, we would pull a cabinet out down the stairs, tear it apart, put it up on the jig, shoot it. And while the photographer was shooting it, the one that was shot here, Brian was getting another one. And we had people helping us. And then to do the rest of it, it was literally one piece at a time in my car over to Albert's house. He would call me in a week and say, "Come get this one and bring me another one." And this went on and on and on and on.
Wow, that is unbelievable. I know, Brian, you've worked, on the road as a guitar tech for 40 years. Bon Jovi, Michael Bolton, Pat Benatar, Neil Giraldo. Peter, you work in the television industry and also a stage manager, and you have a famous relative, right? Did I see a video where you were talking about that?
I have a couple famous relatives. Um, my mother's brother was a game show host of Let's Make a Deal. His name is Monty Hall.
Oh yeah.
Rest in peace. And my brother was a famous TV director named Jeff Margolis. He directed the Academy Awards and Miss America, Emmy Awards, and American Music Awards, and all these big event live television shows. He passed last year, and strange, oddly, and Brian can tell you because Brian was at my house at the time. The book was delivered to my house here, um, in a very large truck with on pallets of boxes of 7 books per box and box after box after box, and it was delivered the day that my brother died.
Oh,
So it was 7:30 in the morning, and Brian and I were up, and I get a text, and 2 hours after I get this text, and now the phone's ringing, and the texts are coming, and the emails and everything else about my famous brother passing. Knock at the door, "Hey, your books are here." So it was a really weird day for me.
yeah. My
For
condolences, man. I didn't know that.
thanks, yeah, for everybody. So
You're in Los Angeles. I don't know if you mentioned it, but you are in LA, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm in LA, and my wife and I have a house here, and we have a house up north. And then Brian lives sort of in between, the two houses.
I'm between
So
Sacramento and South Lake Tahoe.
Gotcha.
yeah,
Okay. Brian, your years on the road, how did that shape the way you approach documenting these artifacts, you can call them, for the book?
I don't know how it shaped me documenting so much as it exposed me the availability to travel around the country and on days off, in the old days anyways, not so much these days, but years ago when all the mom and pop music stores were all that there was across the country. Well, on days off, you could go into those places and you could find used musical equipment, specifically old Marshalls people had traded in on something new. And so as you traveled around here and there, you would acquire a few things or run into various musicians who just got some new endorsement of some, cool product, and they got a pickup truckload of it for free, and they won't be needing those old Marshalls anymore. Do you know anybody that could use those? and I was, right in the catbird seat on a lot of things like that, where some well-known people decided to get rid of certain things or a whole bunch of things. There were times where I was in a position where I find out a band was going to get rid of all of their Marshalls, like a whole back line's worth, and I would make arrangements to buy as much of it as I could.
What is it about the Marshall amps that you love so much? Like, what is it? What
Uh,
draws you to it?
their sound, the differences that they have. They're so versatile in that they make a lot of different products that are specifically geared for certain things. A lot of people don't realize that about them until you start to get deep in the weeds with them. But yeah, they make a lot of amplifiers that aren't necessarily just rock and roll amplifiers or whatever. And the rock and roll amplifiers, there are varying tonal qualities and uh, sweet spots in our industry for the sound of certain amplifiers. If you're going to do certain things, well, then one particular Marshall head is, traditionally what everybody uses. Or if you're going to do something else, well, there's a different model that does that particular thing. Fenders have their certain sounds too, and there again, they have a variety of different models, and they're all slightly different in some way. But it's the Marshall amps were in the '70s when I grew up. They were the rock and roll amplifier. People played all the big rock and roll bands played Marshalls, and some of them played some high watts.
I've read that the story began with British guitars like Pete Townsend and Richie Blackmore. They wanted something louder, something thicker, more distorted.
Yeah, that's it all evolved in the mid '60s this way as performers played in venues with larger amounts of people, they had trouble hearing themselves. So they would need, a little bit louder amplifier. And, you know, different people went to Jim Marshall and said, can you custom make me something? And he had a couple of engineers working with him, and he was game for, playing experiment with different folks and try to have his amp guys design something that would make them happy. And when they'd get somebody that would be happy, well, then they'd take the notes of what all those components were and how they were laid out, and see about making more of them for somebody else.
What is Jim Marshall's backstory?
He was a drummer.
Jazz drummer.
He was a drummer, and he had a music school.
Yeah, and a store that was, right location, right time, and the right people like, Clapton and Jeff Beck and Townsend
He
would
was an
frequent this.
entrepreneur at the right time in history. Nobody else specifically was making stuff. People asked him, and he just went, "Hey, I know some engineers, and let me try to help you out. Maybe I can make something for you." And it just, his offering to help people turned into one of the world's most famous amp companies.
My first experience with these was, as a young kid, 14, 15, and somebody from school had a Robin Trower record. And it was really my first experience with rock and roll. I was not raised with rock and roll. My dad was a stand-up jazz big band bass player and exposed me to big band music. And my mother was a classical music and opera freak. So that's all we ever had. And it was in junior high, I think in the ninth grade, that, somebody said, "Hey, you got to listen to this Robin Trower record. He's playing at the Long Beach Arena. We should go." And so I went to go see him. I think I was 15 at the time. I tell the story in the book. And we walked in right as he was, playing the opening song, which was called Long Misty Days. And it was this sort of, I think it was one of the only times, if not the only time, he ever used a fuzz pedal. And it was this fuzzed, soaked, sound with I think 4 or 6 Fawn Marshall cabinets behind him and Marshall heads, and he's playing this white Strat, early '70s Strat, and I looked at it and I went, "That's it. That's what I'm gonna do. That's the look."
Instant.
And it just it hit me, and I just loved what I saw. I loved the music, I loved the sound, I loved the look of it, and then spent my entire life pursuing that. At a certain point, not as a performer anymore, but the more you know about the Marshall amps, the more you realize you don't know, the more you want to learn, at least for me. And, thankfully I met Brian at the right time. And it's sort of, my belief is everything happens for a reason, and the universe hands people certain situations at certain times for whatever the reason was. It took the earthquake for me to meet Brian. But if I didn't know Bob Bradshaw, I never would have met Brian. I wouldn't have known about it. I'd probably still have 20 Marshall cabinets with holes in the grills, or I would have just eventually sold all of them, not knowing what I had. And it was just because, the universe put him and he and I together, and we had this mutual, we're basically the same age, and we had this, mutual affection for these things. And his experience seeing him the first time is a little bit different from my experience, but then, he was around them all the time. And you learn to appreciate what these things were. And there's several people that make things that look like them or sound similar to them, or give you the same presentation, but really they were the first, and there is no replicating some of their sounds. You can get really close by modeling, the fractals and the XFX and all that can get really close. But if you've ever been on stage like I have and stood in front of them, there's nothing like it. There just isn't.
I hate to throw that word around genius a lot, but Jim Marshall seems like he was a genius.
Well, not only he was a marketing genius, and he knew how to deliver what people wanted. And he was a really affable guy. People loved him, and he listened to what the artist said, and he had the right product at the right time, and sort of went along with the times. And when things in the 70s, it started to get larger, and heels got bigger, and bell bottoms got bigger, his logos got bigger, and the colors sort of got more wild, and the oranges, and and the yellows, and that sort of went along with that time. He listened to people, and he sort of followed the trends a little bit, but stayed true to what he had. He knew that what he had was popular. He was helped along the way by Clapton and by Hendrix, and Hendrix probably more so than anybody helped push Jim, out into the world, really. But Jim had a product that, they're still making. Not a lot of companies that were in business in 1963, are still really successful and still making great sounding stuff.
One of the interesting things of the 70s that Jim was doing was all the different colors. They started becoming available in 68, roughly 60, late 67, 68, but they really kind of caught on in the 70s. And a lot of people, they see the book and they don't realize that in the old days, there were a lot of colored amplifiers. And that's because we're going back again to the days of the mom and pop music stores in America. And a colored amplifier in those days was like ordering a colored Fender Stratocaster. There was a little bit of an upcharge for getting, something that wasn't, a black amp. And so your mom and pop music stores typically were not ordering any of the colored amplifiers in to have for sale on the floor because they were going to be more expensive, and they weren't sure that they were going to sell them. And at the time, there were very few stores that you could walk into that even had a brochure or a catalog. You just went with it, whatever the store people told you. And so only your big stores like Manny's and Sam Ash in New York City, those kind of places in America, were the ones that sold a lot of the colored amplifiers in the late 60s and first few years of the 70s, because they had the volume of business to order in a few stacks or a few pieces of different colors, and not be upset if they didn't sell for a couple of months. And so, they've always kind of been available for years and years. But you kind of had to know where to go or who to talk to get hold of the colored stuff.
The primary color though is gold and beige, yellow. That seemed to be
The standard covering is the black vinyl covering. The grill cloths, depending on the year, went from the pinstripe of the 60s into the basket weave of the, later 60s, early 70s, and that became the larger checkerboard, which became the smaller checkerboard, which became the black. Um, when you look at them, they can be, depending on how much sunlight they've seen, they can be various stages of, brown, the grills. They're typically gray, sort of gray in color. But when they see some sun, they turn brown pretty quickly. And then the standard color that you see most of the time is black, because like Brian was saying, that's typically what's available. The reds and the yellows and the blues and the fawns were made in much smaller quantity. And like Brian was saying, they went to the bigger stores, the Sam Ashes and the Manny's and eventually the Guitar Centers. Um, but they just weren't they didn't really catch on until later, and they became more popular. And then, like Fender Stratocasters that are anything but sunburst, there's a markup for them significantly now. When you're able to find an older, red stack or orange or white or whatever, you're going to pay a premium for them because there just aren't as many.
What may have been 10% upcharge back when it was made is way, way more than 10% difference in price over a black amplifier today.
right.
One thing that helped Brian and I in our search for collecting these, they were very, very popular in the 80s with the hair metal bands. You'd see the old MTV videos, and there was, all the Warrant and Winger and, all the bands with the stacks of, Judas Priest, stacks of Marshalls behind them. That sort of went by the wayside when Nirvana came on and, changed music. In the 90s, everybody was getting rid of their Marshalls, and they were getting, Fender Roland jazz choruses and smaller amplifiers. Brian and I would go to like black market music in LA at this time, and there'd be stacks and stacks and stacks of Marshalls there, endless, because people had turned them in, for their Fender amps, or their Vox AC30s became really popular. And there was a time where we were buying these things like crazy because people were unloading them. And both of us just realized that at some point in time, this is going to turn around, and it did.
And when was that?
Early 2000s.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe a little bit before the time reverb started to become popular, but yeah, somewhere around the 2000s, early 2000s, we started. So there's a funny story. Brian and I, we were together in the late 90s, and there was a music store out in Studio City, and we'd driven by, and then we saw a couple Marshall cabinets and pulled over and went inside the store, and they had two late 60s basket weave cabinets with the original speakers, and they had a $900 price tag on them. We looked at each other and was like, $900? Oh my God, it's a ridiculous.
That was the high water mark in those days.
And we didn't buy them because it was just, it was too expensive. You can't get a speaker from those cabinets now for $900, let alone all four, let alone inside of original cabinet. That $900 has become four and five and 6,000. Um, and so it's, and Brian can talk about this. It's supply and demand. And as we have these natural disasters, and we have earthquakes, and we have specifically floods, and we have fires like we had in the Palisades and in Altadena last year. These are areas of very large homes and guys who collect guitars and cars and amplifiers and baseball cards and all sorts of things, people with money in these homes. And every time these fires take out thousands of homes, or floods take out, you see these pictures of these houses that are, up to the roof line in water. Well, they're filled with AC30s and they're filled with Marshalls and they're filled with Fender Strats and they're destroyed. And so as time moves on, there's less and less and less and less of these things. So, that laws of supply and demand, greater demand, lesser supply, equals, the price going up. And that's also what has happened with this. So whereas, you would see something that was a couple $1,000s a few years ago, Brian and I talk about this all the time. We're constantly sending each other things that we see and go, can you believe this? You and I we paid $1,000 for this. It's now, $7,000.
Wow.
It's like buying Apple stock in the early days or Starbucks. It was really dumb luck for us that this stuff took off the way it did.
In the older Marshall stuff, the older and further back you get, the scarcer the production was. At the beginning, things were made by hand to order. There were no amplifiers built sitting on the shelf waiting for somebody to come along and go, hey, you want to try this thing we built for you? No, everything was built as an order for the first couple, 3 years. And then by the late 60s, it was getting into what we call batch production, where they would take a specific model number and, let's say, make a batch of 20 of them that they had orders for, and then make a batch of like a dozen or 15 of another model number. And eventually they'd come around after 3, 4 model numbers, they'd come back around to the first model number and then make another batch of those. And so there were a lot of component changes sometimes with some of these amplifiers in the batch made and 1 or 2 off made amplifiers. And so you can get an amplifier where there may have only been, you know, 15 or 20 amplifiers that share the identical components that yours did. And the next batch of them that was made has 2 or 3 components that are different, but yet it's kind of the same amp. And so as you realize this, and with the natural disasters and the rarity of these amplifiers and stuff, as time goes on, some of this stuff, even the early 70s stuff, they started making them by the 50s and the 100s instead of the dozens, but they were still not really, really mass produced until the 1980s when the JCM 800 series came along. And that's why those particular amplifiers in that series, other than a few specific specialty ones, they don't have a huge, huge value to them because whatever you might like, trust me, they made thousands upon thousands of them, not dozens. They only made a handful of what you see there. And that's what creates the price today.
If there was a complaint about our book, it's that, why didn't you guys talk about the JCM 800s or the 900s or, these other later models? And it was like, well, number one, they were, like Brian just said, mass produced. And we don't own any of them because what we're interested in is the stuff that wasn't mass produced. And, from 64 through 80, where, they were still, like Brian said, sort of batch making them. And it wasn't really until the, late 70s, early 80s into the 80s with the JCM 800 and 900 and, and onward, where there were just they sound great, they're interesting, they're great products, and there's no slight on them. They're just not what we're into. And so we didn't want to talk about something in a book for, just to talk about, we don't own them. So to say, to have a chapter on the JCM 800 or 900, we felt like it was disingenuous, why do it when we don't have them?
Peter Margolis, Brian Ranks, authors of Collecting Loud History. What's the rarest Marshall that you encountered?
I'm glad you asked, and it's strangely the most recent one
Okay.
that I got. I'm going to say, and I think Brian's going to agree. So along the way in this evolution of collecting and my relationship with Brian and starting to get to the point where I would get calls from certain stores that would get a piece of gear in it. They would call Brian and go, hey, this Marshall just walked in the door. Before we put a price tag on it, let me send you some pictures and see if you're interested. Because they knew that Brian and I were buying lots of stuff. So it's like, why make it hard on yourself and put it out on the floor and wait for it to sell or hope it sells and hope you don't have to drop the price when I can just pick up the phone and call Peter or Brian, and odds are they're going to want to buy it or know somebody that's looking for it. So I don't know, a decade or so ago, I get a phone call from the guy who owns a store called Killer Vintage, and he says, "Hey, I have a client, and he's got a Marshall combo, and he thinks that it's real and it's rare, but he really would like you guys to confirm it. He knows that, you know, I know you guys. I've sold you some stuff. Would you mind doing that?" So I said no, and so they sent it, and I pulled it apart, and I think I was on with Brian, or Brian was, I don't remember, but we took it down. We took staples out, literally one or two, and we looked at the patina on the staples and the type of staples that were used. Then we opened it up, and we took the chassis apart and got out a magnifying glass and started to look at these part numbers on the capacitors and the resistors, and looked at the solder joints and really took this thing to task. And it was a real Marshall. It was not the year that the the proprietor that sold it to this guy, it was not Killer Vintage, it was another store, sold it to this client, said it's a 1964. We took it apart, determined it wasn't a 64. It was a real Marshall, but it was a 67. Well, there's a big difference in price between those two. And so we got it buttoned up, took a bunch of pictures of it. I called the store. We packed it back up. Somebody came, collected it, sent it back off to Texas, which is where one of their stores is. And a couple days later, I get a call saying, "Hey, thank you very much. The guy who owns this wants to send you a check." And I said, "Not necessary. This was fun for us." And I said, "Tell him thank you, but no thanks, but no thanks." And he said, "Okay, well, he'd like to at least call you and say thank you and talk to you." And, I said, "Great, have him give me a call." And a couple minutes later, I answer the phone, and I hear, "Hey, Peter, this is Eric Johnson." And, I don't know, for your
The
listeners,
Eric Johnson we're talking about?
the Eric
The
Johnson,
guitarist? Okay.
yes, who might not know, Eric Johnson is probably one of the most well-known guitar players alive.
Cliffs of Dover was played on my local rock station.
Incredible musician, incredible writer, incredible player, incredible singer, recording artist, and equally nice human being. And we ended up on the phone for a couple hours talking about the amp and amplifiers in general, and you recording, and on and on and on. And I couldn't believe I was, it'd be like Jimi Hendrix calling, and the equivalent. And he said, "Listen, I'm coming to town. I'm playing at this place out in the valley, and I'd like to at least send you some tickets and or put you on the list, you and your wife." And I said, "Yeah, we would love to come down and see you." So my wife and I went to see him, and he sent me his Guitar Tech's phone number, and he said, "Text him after the show. He'll open the door and take you into the dressing room, and I want to say hi to you, and whatever." So I did, and we're in there with Eric, and he goes, "Hey, listen, I don't want to be presumptuous, but I put an amp in the bus that I'm not using anymore, and I just want you to take it home and see if you like it." And I'm thinking to myself, I just met you. Like, we had one phone conversation, and I saw one show, and you want me to take an amplifier home? And I was like, "Oh, okay." So his tech goes to the bus, he gets this amplifier, and he comes back with a late 1967 uh, Marshall 100 watt. It's called a Black Flag. And as Brian can testify, these amps were made maybe 6 weeks, Brian, maybe 8 weeks in late 67. I don't know if they made 2 dozen of them.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, this amplifier walks in, and I immediately noticed the little, you know, telltale sign. And he goes, I just, this is one from my collection I'm just not using anymore. And he hands this thing over, and it's pristine. And and he said, take it home. And I went, take it home. He said, yeah, take it home and play it. And when I'm off the road, I'll give you a call and we can talk about it. It's like, okay. So I put it in the car, take it home. Brian was in town. We took this thing apart. We could not believe what we were looking at. And, plugged it in, turned it up, and, it sounded like Eric Johnson.
Man.
And it was like, oh, okay. Well, clearly I don't own one of these. I'm absolutely going to take it. And then he gets off the road and he said, what do you think? And I said, it's unbelievable. And he said, okay, send me, a check for X. And I'm thinking, well, that's like way less than what this is worth. And he goes, well, that's what I paid for it. And are you sure? Yeah, I'm positive. So, okay. So I sent him a check, and that began a friendship with Eric that's still to this day. I've probably bought 20, 25 pieces. Brian's bought stuff from him. And so to answer your question, most recently, he called a couple months ago and he said, hey, I've got this amp. It's a 65 or 66 JTM 45 tremolo. And I went, JTM 45 tremolo. Boy, those don't exist. Those are only in combo form. Blues breakers. I've never seen one in a head, ever. So I called Brian. I go, you ever seen an ant? He goes, nope. Sure enough, box arrives. We pull it out, and Brian and I are absolutely dumbfounded. We know a lot about these amps. We have never seen this, and it is 100% bone stock. And Eric wrote me a note and said, this is the amplifier that I've used for all my recording and touring for the last 7 or 8 years, selling it to Peter Margolis, blah, 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 date, amount. And we were just like, we didn't know that this existed because, plenty of JTM 45s made, but with a tremolo circuit in it, only ever in a blues breaker combo.
The issue was made in a very limited run for extra money.
So
That's
when
the
you
Indiana Jones moment right there.
when you ask about rarity, that's one. Eric sold me during COVID. He was cleaning out his closet and he sold me another JTM 45 um, that was only made for the German market. So it didn't have this traditional Marshall logo on it. It has a logo that says the big M.
Hmm.
Because I guess when Jim sold stuff to Germany, there was already a product there with a called Marshall. So we had to rename it and called it the Big M. So I've seen now one other piece of Big M. Brian and I just saw another collector that's got one. So probably my rarest stuff has come from Eric Johnson. And there are a number of cabinets that Brian and I purchased from him and a lot of speakers. And I don't know what else is in this guy's closet, but I have bought a lot of stuff from him.
So this kind of dovetails into my question, which maybe you've already answered it, but like somebody finds a Marshall, they go in their basement and say, "Oh, I've got this Marshall amp. I've had this for years." What should they check for? Is there something, or do they have to take it to somebody like yourselves to open it up to determine whether it's something rare or not?
Well, the first thing they do is buy the book because
All right.
odds are that what they have is going to be in this book.
Okay.
Made from 1964 through 1980, it's going to be in here or something very close to it. So that's how they're going to identify it first. Um, if they don't have the book or they don't know about the book, generally people would start to ask around, does anybody know what these are? And they'll wind up in a store and the store will try to buy it from them if it's something that's got any value.
But nothing like the naked eye could see, like you mentioned, the staples or anything that
Well,
might look.
yes, if it's an amplifier and you turn it on the back, there's going to be a series of numbers and a letter. That letter will tell you what year it is. So they could at least get it down to that.
Okay.
Sometimes if you take the back off, and get in there just right with a flashlight, there'll be a white tag on the corner of the chassis. And if you can still read, what's the ink stamp and the signatures and what was written there, you can find out the date that it was made. Although in England they reverse the month and the day. So don't confuse yourself if you see, 111 versus 11/1. It's, November 1st versus January 11th. But sometimes you'll be able to read the person's handwriting and you'll see it was made, November 1st, 1973, whatever it says. And that would be a letter E. So you would be able to identify it that way. Sometimes those tags don't exist, or they've, the glue has got heated up and they've fallen off, or you can't read them anymore. Um, so, and if it's a cabinet, very difficult, very difficult to unless you really know what you have, very difficult to identify. Because the serial numbers on cabinets are not nearly as consistent as they were on heads. And there are certain years where they repeated numbers. And with the cabinets, even if the speakers date you to a certain date, doesn't mean those are original speakers to that cabinet. They may have been replaced. So
Okay.
you really have to get into the weeds with these things and get down to what rivets were used, or were there rivets? Are there plastic parts on them, or are there metal parts? And are there, screws? What kind? How many threads? What's the pitch of the thread? T-nuts, rivets, and you have to know the hardware to really know what you have. And that's where our book is helpful, because can go to the back and go, I've got this thing that had a rivet on it. What is it? Well, it's a domed rivet. Well, then it falls into this year. Flat rivet, then it's this year. No rivet, screw, no plastic, our book tells you all that. So that's will help people identify what they have.
There's publications in the past, and with the lettering code on for serial number stuff with amplifiers, it's really, really simple. You can just go right on the internet, look it up, and it'll tell you everything. But for speaker cabinets, there is no such thing. If you were to go to Google and type in Google Images and punch in what does a 1972 Marshall slant cabinet look like? Well, you're going to get a shock, because you're going to get about 6 different looks of a cabinet, all claiming to be in 1972. And that's because the internet doesn't determine whether somebody's selling information is correct or incorrect. It just goes by what they claim it to be. So if somebody is selling a 1985 cabinet and claiming it as a 1972, Google shows it as a 1972. Very confusing for everybody on the internet. So our book is, clearing up all that. And this is the reason that in the 80s that I started collecting all the data and writing down vast batches of information, so that I myself could tell, this year what I'm looking at, how does that compare with the stuff I've seen in the last 4 or 5 years?
Here's an example. So this is from the parts section of our book, and this is showing screws and rivets and T-nuts and different things and identifying, if you see something that looks like this, odds are you have a 1971 or a 72. And if it looks like this second photo, then it's from 74, 75. So it really tells you, like, this is all the, plastic mounting hardware, and then there's pages on wheels and pages on, like, different corners that would have been on the cabinets. And, it's a page that'll look like that. So
Okay.
this book really helps you identify what you have. And that was part of the purpose of it. The other part was to talk about our collection and all the various models and show people pictures. The beauty of the book is anybody can look at a picture online of a Marshall head or a Marshall cabinet. What you don't see is we took ours, the chassis, out of the box. We had a jig built to hold the chassis, and then we flipped it upside down and we shot the circuit boards in this particular jig. And then once we had all the photos, our book designer painted the jig out of every single photo. So it looks like the chassis is sort of floating in air, and you can really get in and see all the components. And we point everything out that because there's a lot of stuff that's been changed, altered, replaced, parts not available anymore. Like there are certain capacitors you just can't get. So when your filter caps go, you can't get the original Eries. You can get close, but you can't get the originals. They're just not made anymore. So we are really honest with every single thing in these heads and cabinets that have been changed. Here's what should have been there. Here's what's there now. But here is an example of one that is untouched, unmolested. Every part in it is correct. May not sound as good as the one that's been fixed, but here is an example that's 100% original. So all of that is in the book. So you can look at a circuit board and go, aha, I have this version. Like for example, in 1967, there were many different versions of circuit boards that were used because they were experimenting. What sounds the best? What do we like? Well, let's put this batch out and then let's make some adjustments and put this next one out. Let's change the transformers. And so in 67, you could have 7 or 8 different heads. None of them will have the exact same components. And so a lot of those versions we have. A lot of changes in 73, we have all of them. A lot of changes in 1976, we have all of them. So you can really get down in the weeds and see, well, what do I have?
To get the book, they have to go to collectingloudhistory.com, right? That is the place to purchase the book.
There's one other place.
Okay.
We made a deal with Chicago Music Exchange. They are the only brick and mortar store that carries our book, and they carry autographed books, signed books. They are the only ones that carry those signed books. So that's how we sort of separated our website from Chicago Music Exchange. If you want a book, a first edition book signed by the authors, go to Chicago Music Exchange. If you want one and you don't care that it's signed or not, and you just want to get it off the website, that's great too. We periodically, once a month, usually for 1 or 2 days, have sales on our website. I think we have one coming up in a couple of days for March Madness, where we're offering the book at $175, $25 off from what we normally sell it for. Chicago Music Exchange sells it for the same thing that we sell it for on the website. We don't want to undercut them, obviously. But they're aware that when we have these 1 or 2 day sales to offer, just it helps us, boost morale a little bit. And sometimes if people are really cost conscious, they can wait for these 1 or 2 day sales that we have every month and they can buy the book at that time.
Cool. We're recording on March 16. I hope to get this up a few days after we record. So people should check the website for those.
And we have a sale every month. So
Okay.
If they don't make it by March, we'll have a Easter sale for April, and we'll have a 4th of July sale, and we'll have Jim Marshall's birthday sale, and we'll have different things. We had February was Valentine's Day, and so we always are trying to be conscious of people's wallets. And one of the questions is that we've been asked. It's funny. We've been asked, why is the book so expensive? And other people have said, you're not charging enough. And one of the things that's important about books, and I know that you're a website that deals with books. Some people are sending their books to China to be printed, which is great because China, you can get your books printed for considerably less than you can in the United States. However, you're not there at the printer when the books are being printed, so you don't know what type of paper. You can specify, I want this particular bond, and I want this cover, and I want this. But we went to the printer, Brian and I, many times. And when they were running this, we went. And then when they're making the cover, we went and talking about the gloss and talking about the page stock and talking about the bind. We went through a whole thing with the stitching and the binding. And I want to see examples. We didn't want the book to fall apart. What kind of glue are you using? How is the cover being put together? And we were there every single step of the way. You can't do that when you send your book off to China. But when you have it printed here, it's going to be way more expensive to have it printed in Los Angeles versus to have it printed overseas. So part of the cost of the book is, Brian and I laid out, well over $100,000 to have these books printed and to pay for the photographers and to pay for our designer and to pay for our, web designer and to pay all of that. And so we're not in this for profit. We're in this to try to make our money back, and break even if we can and get this information out there.
It's a passion project and you wanted it done right.
100%. I mean, there was myself and Brian and Denny. We're basically the three. Then the two photographers, Pete and Albert. Kaylee was the web designer who designed collectingloudhistory.com. And Paul owned, the printing company. Or is, one of the owners, or I don't know his position there, but Paul was the printer essentially. And that's it. That's everybody that worked on the book. And when we shot photographs here and we were here for extended periods of time, my wife was doing craft service and feeding us. And that's everybody. It was a grassroots, pull your bootstraps up, get up in the morning, lift these Marshall cabinets, get them torn apart, get ready for the photographer, work all day long, and try to get everything outside for magic hour at the end of the day to get the beautiful outdoor shots that we got. Then, everybody would leave and Brian and I would be left to put these things back together and get them back up and then, work until midnight to get the ones ready for the next morning. And if you don't love it, if this is not a passion project for you, this is not. I mean, Norm Harris at Norm's Rare Guitars said to me, you got to be out of your mind to do this. And it just was like, Brian and I aren't getting any younger, and we didn't want to die with this information. We wanted it out there, and so that was the point of doing it.
And one of the other things too that Eric that we had realized is that Peter's collection has grown to be rather large. My collection is got well over 100 pieces of Marshall gear in it, and our dear friend Dave Amato has like 150 or 160 Marshalls in his collection. And while the three of us friends still have all this stuff, now was the time to do a book, get the photos of stuff, because as we age a few more years, and it's already kind of starting, we're getting to the retirement age where we're going to start thinning out these things. And this quantity of 500 plus pieces of Marshall gear between us will be in the hands of 50 or 60 different individuals and be spread all over the world. And instead of being in one location where we can kind of sort of put together photo shoots and make a book come together with it all.
When we were trying to come up with a title, and I give all credit to Brian because Brian is the one who suggested Collecting Loud History. Our company is called the Loud Brothers. And it was Brian's suggestion. But while we were trying to come up with a title, one of my suggestions was Only for the Curious, because it really is a niche market. Not everybody knows what these things are. Not everybody can walk into a store and identify them. And it is really for the curious. It's for collectors who are really interested. It's also an art book. And the photographs are really, really stunning.
Absolutely. Yes.
So I think, for people who are book collectors, and people who, might enjoy your podcast being that it's about books, we ran 1,500 of these. There is probably never going to be another run. There are no softcover copies of these other than the couple of prototypes that we did just for us. So it's a first edition hardcover copy, and it will probably never be replicated. And, for book collectors, this is really something that, you should have in your collection.
Collectingloudhistory.com, again, is the website. All right, guys, Peter Margolis and Brian Ranks, thank you so much for coming on.
Eric, thank you.